Hi, everybody. Let me know if you can hear me okay. I put you all on mute, but there is a chat box that's available to use. So if you can hear me okay, could you please indicate so using the chat box and type in your response? Hey, Paul, thanks. Appreciate that. Good to see you. Well, not see you. I'll see you on Friday. Hey, Steve. Hi, Melissa. We'll get started here somewhat shortly, a few minutes. And hopefully you can see the title screen, Sociology and Experience Design. I know it's 12 o'clock. We'll get started here in a few minutes. I just want to make sure that people have a chance to log in and attend. I know sometimes for me, if I'm logging into a new webinar feature, it's going to ask me to download stuff I didn't have to download before. So we'll just wait a couple more minutes. I appreciate your patience. All right, folks, we'll get started. It's 12:02. I just want to make sure, can everybody see the title screen? It says Sociology and Experience Design. If you can, okay, great, fantastic. Um, I appreciate everyone taking the time today to take place in this webinar on sociology and experience design. I'm Gary David. I am a professor at Bentley University, where I'm also the department chair of the Department of Sociology. I hold a secondary appointment in the Department of Information Design and Corporate Communication. And I also have my own consultancy called Ethno-Analytics, where you can get information on that at ethno-analytics.com. And I'll talk more about those things as we go through the webinar and how my work as a sociologist and as a consultant fits into the area of experience design. I want to thank the people and the organizations that made today possible, including Bentley University. Recently, our Human Factors and Information Design program, or our user experience program, was ranked 7th in the country, which we're all really proud of, and it's perennially ranked very high among other programs that do design, UX, and human-computer interaction degree programs. I also have to give a really big shout out to our computing services department, because as of 1 hour ago, this PowerPoint presentation was locked on my computer, which was inaccessible because it had crashed. So about an hour ago, I was frantically trying to see if they could retrieve this presentation from my hard drive so that I could get a loaner and do this for you right now. And they came through with time to spare to allow me to actually finish the webinar, which I planned to do this morning, but couldn't because my computer crashed. So not only do we have a great user experience grad program, but we also have a really good computing services program, computing services department. So thanks to those folks. I also want to thank the Association for Applied and Clinical Sociology, of which I am the immediate past president. And as part of our organizational effort to bring more content to both members and non-members, we started our Applied U program. And this webinar, which is being recorded right now, fingers crossed, will be made available on our YouTube site, ACS Applied U, in a couple days. And you will be able to see other webinars that we'll be doing on a monthly basis at that website as well, including the one I gave last month called Crafting Your Sociological Brand. So if there's any sociologists listening to this and you want to find out more about how you develop a brand as a sociologist to communicate what it is you do to others who might be in need of your assistance, please take some time and give that a listen as well. And also, as I mentioned, my consultancy, Ethnoanalytics, which the word refers to the idea of combining both big data with local context. And as I will often say to my students, information does not exist on its own. In order to have information, you have to combine both data and context to create information, and then have the awareness to turn that information into something strategic and actionable. And that's going to be a big thrust of what I'm going to be talking about today, is how sociology adds those elements to our data, and how by using sociological insights and perspectives, we can lend our expertise to the area of experience design and really start to develop innovative solutions and integrative experiences. Here's a little bit more about me, where it lists some information, my consulting and training projects. If anybody would like any more information on these materials or on my work in these areas, by all means, you can reach out to me. And also there's my LinkedIn profile and both of my Twitter handles, which you can communicate with me as well. I will be teaching, as part of our Graduate School of Business, 2 courses related to these topics. I'll be teaching my graduate program course in human factors on ethnography and experience design this spring. I'll also be teaching a brand new MBA course on employee experience in the summer of 2019. Even if you're not members or you're not students in either of these programs and you'd like further information on this content, by all means reach out to me, and my email will be at the end of the webinar, but also gdavid@bentley.edu, and we can communicate with ways in which that content can be delivered to you and your organization in a format that is more accessible if you're not part of our MBA program. I will also say that everyone's muted right now. If you have any questions or comments anytime along the way, feel free to use our chat function that's part of our Zoom webinar tool. So the content of our webinar is as follows. I wanted to talk about what is this idea of experience and how do we study it? What is this field of experience design that's been emerging relatively quickly over the last, as a field that really integrates a variety of different experience areas, subdisciplines, within the last 5 years or so. Different design methodologies, both bridging design approaches with sociological investigation approaches, adopting what I would call an ecosystems perspective, and also the why of experience design. Why do experience design? What I find really exciting about this field, both as a person who is a consultant and also as a sociologist who originally entered into sociology, like many of us, as someone who is seeking to provide assistance and help to those who needed it. And on that point, I did want to mention something about the audience for today's webinar. Those who signed up are both coming from business fields and sociological fields. So we really have a mixed audience. So at some points, I'll be speaking more to the sociologists in the audience who are seeking to understand experience design. And at other times, I'll be addressing the experience designers and other designers who are trying to understand sociology. So I'll be moving back and forth, translating between the 2 groups, which I think is a sociological skill. As one of my professors in my PhD program said, sociologists need to be really good social brokers, moving in between groups, between areas. I would also say that community organizers need to do the same thing so that we can communicate to one another. We need to be good, effective translators, and that's one of the skill sets I think that sociologists can possess, given the kind of work that we do and the kind of breadth of areas that we cover. We're able to move in between different groups and different audiences and communicate effectively and create understanding among all of them. One other point about sociology that I wanted to talk about here is the different levels of sociology. beginning of the webinar, there were the letters CCS after my name, along with PhD. PhD is probably self-explanatory. CCS, not so much. CCS stands for Certified Clinical Sociologist. And just to keep it simple, the way I talk about it, a foundational sociologist would be any of us who have gone through sociological training and learned the theories, concepts, and methods associated with doing sociological inquiry. The applied sociologist takes those theories, concepts, and methods and then uses them to increase understanding to non-academic audiences. So there's a element of translation that goes on where we're using what we know as sociologists to communicate to others to increase their understanding. The clinical sociologist is concerned with implementation. We're trying to take that same understanding, translate it to those same audiences, but at the same time design solutions. And this is where we come with these three levels: foundational, translational, and implementation, right? We're using what we know, translate it to other audiences, and then going one step more and saying, here's what we could do, working with them to create solutions. And experience design ultimately is about designing solutions, as we'll talk about. It's about designing solutions to improve experience across many different channels of experience, and also create alignment and integration of those experience channels to deliver a more cohesive experience strategy for any organization that you're trying to work with. And so this brings us to this question of what exactly is experience? And this is a really loaded concept. And when I've interviewed a lot of customer experience professionals, and I've asked them the question, how do you define customer and how do you define experience? Because we even in user experience or patient experience, we just can't leave these terms hanging out there as if we all know what they mean. But one of the things that I think we need to do is problematize those a little bit in order to really dig into what they mean. And this is where being an academic comes in handy, because we are, if anything, annoying at problematizing concepts, of not just accepting what we think something means or what the shared meaning might assume to mean, but really digging into and querying and interrogating those words and those concepts to figure out what they do mean or what they can mean. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this story that came in the news recently, where Payless shoe stores, maybe some of you go shop there. I know I frequent bargain shoe stores quite frequently. Payless wanted to push the social experiment genre to new extremes and make a cultural statement. And Payless, a discount shoe store selling, various kinds of shoes, but at cut rate prices, not associated with high culture or high fashion. What they did was they opened up a mock store that they called Paylessy, changed the spelling a little bit, added the I at the end, which I guess was an attempt to go for Italian fashion kind of construct, and invited a lot of social media influencers to this grand opening where they were going to have the first chance at looking at these shoes and these fashionable footwear items in this new fancy store. And as the title here says, discount shoe retailer Payless opened a fake luxury store and convinced influencers to pay $600 for $20 footwear. Working at a business school, I've been here for 19 years now, 18 years. And a lot of my students will say, well, price is set by supply and demand. I mean, this is the rational approach of economics that many of them learn. As supply goes up and demand goes down, price will go down. As demand goes up and supply goes down, price will go up. But what we do know now is that people aren't rational. Well, we've always known this. Sociologists have always known people aren't rational because we study them all the time, especially in groups they're not rational. And Payless was able to use behavioral economics to construct an experience that resulted in people paying a lot more than what they would typically sell those same shoes for. And this story really does put an exclamation point on the fact that experience design is about creating that experience. And when you create a certain experience for people, they will ultimately react, or often react, accordingly. Not always. People aren't just automatons. They're not just cultural dopes who are running around doing what they're programmed. We have some flexibility. But as sociologists, we also know how norms, expectations, rules, culture, context, peers. We know all these social concepts function in these kinds of spaces to create a certain kind of outcome. And this is where, as I've been involved in looking at user experience and teaching our program now for almost 10 years, the individual focus, while an important starting off point, isn't the ultimate endpoint. I'll talk more about this at the end of the webinar, towards the end of the webinar, but you're really looking at how to create a social context, a social experience within a certain context to achieve a particular kind of outcome. And when we talk about experience design and sociology, that's one of the key takeaways that I think it's important to consider. And I did what a lot of my students will do is, looked at how can we define experience? What are the different ways we can do it? You go to the dictionary, right? And there were 3 definitions that came up right away. Practical contact with an observation of facts or events, the knowledge or skill acquired by experience over a period of time, and an event or occurrence that leaves an impression on someone. And I want to focus on this last one a bit, because really we're talking about both the first and the second, or the third, I should say. This idea of practical contact with an observation of facts or events. So you have a contact with a certain kind of event, but that event leaves some kind of impression. And just as a side note here, there is a lot of discussion in experience design and customer experience, or even user experience, patient experience, student experience on a college campus. To what extent are we looking to create this wow moment, right? This experience that leaves an impression on someone, kind of like the Disneyland version or the Rainforest Cafe version of experience, where you're creating this big thing that happens that is a memorable moment. Or to what extent are we just trying to create effortless experiences or seamless experiences or mundane experiences that meet with our expectations of how things should work? Not everything needs to be a wow experience. Not everything needs to be surprise and delight. Sometimes we are delighted just by things working the way they should. Like this morning when I turned my computer on, I wasn't expecting it to freeze during an update. That was a really bad experience. I just wanted the mundane experience of it opening and turning on. I didn't need anything more than that. That would have been fine. And we could probably all go back and think about times where organizations have tried to deliver a wow experience and failed because that's not what we were looking for. And so we're both looking at understanding when people expect a wow, when they expect the mundane, and how to manage the construction and creation of those things. John Dewey, an American philosopher who wrote quite a bit about experience, especially in experiential education. He had the quote, "We have an experience when the material experience runs its course to fulfillment." There's a lot we could do with unpackaging that, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but I do think that Dewey's assessment here is an interesting one, that it runs to its fulfillment. We've achieved our goals. And in some ways, Dewey's statement here is perhaps predicting the idea of looking at journey mapping, of mapping people's journeys from a certain start point to an end point and looking at the totality of their experience. So it's not just one waypoint along that journey, but it's the totality of that journey that's taking place. Pine and Gilmore wrote the paper, Welcome to the Experience Economy, which subsequently became a book on the experience economy. This was originally was in Harvard Business Review, where they talk about an experience occurs when a company intentionally uses services as a stage and goods as props to engage individual customers in a way that creates a memorable event. So Pine and Gilmore talking about the service economy is now giving way to the experience economy. For those who are sociologists and maybe others, we can think about agrarian economy, manufacturing economy, service economy. Now Pine and Gilmore are saying we're in an experience economy where, reflecting back on Irving Goffman's dramaturgical self, right? Idea, being a stage, services are the stage, goods are the props, and we have to create this moment that is magical. And even today, you can look at some hospitals, trying to understand how we can use Disneyland as a as a model for delivering healthcare. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But I do also want to call back to attention the idea that, does everything need to be a wow experience? Can we just provide experience that's simple, basic, and not anything that requires us to expend any cognitive load on trying to understand it? We just want something simple and straightforward. The consulting company Forrester, research and consulting company, talks about customer experience is how customers perceive their interactions with your company. We'll talk a little bit more about customer experience in a second, but I wanted to focus in on this notion of perception, that it's not just what happens, it's not just what takes place, but it's the perception of what takes place. Once again, for those who are sociologists, this should be really reminiscent, whether it's the idea of the social construction of reality, right? Or going to W.I. Thomas, whose Thomas' theorem said, if men define situation as real, they are real in their consequences. Right now, and I'm not trying to get political here, but in this moment of quote unquote fake news, there's this idea, this active debate in media of, do facts matter anymore? And as sociologists, we're not unfamiliar with this conversation. We're not unfamiliar with the fact that facts sometimes don't matter. It's what people believe to be true that drives their action. And if people think something's real, then the consequences of that belief will be real. We will feel those consequences in what people do as a result. So even though right now experience design is coming up with this idea of perception, this is something as sociologists we've been well familiar with going back a long time around how people experience their everyday lives. I should add, on this point about perception and interaction, that ultimately, though, it's not just about how people perceive their interactions, because there are also the interactions themselves. Myself, and for those who are online who are sociologists, they might be familiar with terms of ethnomethodology and conversation analysis. Ethnomethodology, broken down, is the study of members' methods. It's how we go about people doing the things they do, and through those activities, construct the environments that become recognizable as themselves. What makes a classroom are not students sitting there. What makes students is what they do that makes them recognizable as students. It's not just my perception of them. They're doing something that we are attending to. And if we fail to attend to them in predictable ways, then that can cause an immense breach in our social order, in the fluid way in which things happen. And so it's not just about perception. It's not just about giving people a survey to look at their net promoter score of what they think happened. We also have to attend to what actually happened. It's not just subjective. There is an objective thing out there that took place. Max Weber, German sociologist. Those of us sociologists, very familiar with Weber, drilled into us as undergraduates, extending through graduate school. This idea of Verstehen, or interpretation, most notable in arts, history, literature, and humanities, looking to capture that subjective experience, our interpretational understanding of what took place. There's a corollary to that as well, right? And I'm not going to say this properly because I don't know German, but erklären, right? Or explanation, where, looking to capture that objective experience. So there's both the experience of practically what happened, the facts of what happened, and then the interpretation of what happened. And as experience designers, as people engaging in experience design, there does need to be a meeting of the minds in those two areas, and attending to what happened and attending to what people perceive to have happened. And let me stop there for a second. And you can use your chat box. Any questions, any comments, any points that people want to bring out that I could either clarify, or I could, think about making sure I touch on as we go forward. Anything? Okay, great. I'll keep going then. And this brings us to, what is this idea of experience design? Okay. And there's not one great definition of experience design. It's an emerging field, it's a nascent field. There's a lot of stuff floating around about what it means. So I'm going to give you a few different definitions, which captures, I think, the range of what these things, what this concept refers to. So here we have a quote from Wired.com: "The strategic role of experience and how to use it to design products, services, and customer interactions accordingly." So here we have this range of, we're creating the products themselves, we're creating the service delivery that takes place around potentially those products, and the customer interactions, both with the products, with the services, and with the people who represent those goods and services. So we start to see the totality of things, right? It's a really big space. It's not just one touch point. Northeastern University has a master's program in experience design. Perhaps I shouldn't be plugging the competition here, but I thought it was a good definition, so we'll go ahead and give them props. I should say you should go to Bentley instead, because we have better parking at least compared to Northeastern, so we got that going for us. Experience design is a holistic and integrative approach to design that focuses on the quality of the human experience in concrete situations. I like this definition because it talks about it's holistic and integrative. There's a lot of different things happening that we're trying to bring together, okay? And I also like it because it talks about concrete situations. There are things that are happening, but I also like it because it still stays muddied because it refers back to itself, right? We're going to define experience by referring to experience. Well, what does experience mean, right? I think it starts to get us to a definition that's usable and workable, but still really does focus on not quite sure what it means. You know, there's still some question marks on there. So I have my definition that I created of experience design. Experience design is the intentional creation, you know, it's strategic, it's planned, of an overall encounter, that, you know, journey, the overall journey that someone goes on in, you know, in getting that experience, through a largely sequential series of integrative moments, individual moments along that experiential journey, embedded in a particular ecosystem. And so breaking that down, we're designing and creating some set of overall encounters that are sequential in nature, that comprise integrative moments in an ecosystem. So, and I'll give examples of this, but just as a for instance, if you're talking about patient experience and you're going to go to the doctor, right? There are a number of different touch points along the way to getting to that moment with the doctor. And I would say that the patient journey doesn't even end there, because there's also, beyond that point of seeing the doctor, other touch points that can take place. So patient experience is not just about that moment with the physician. It's about their experience with the healthcare system in general. And that's where we get into this ecosystem, right? It's hard to divorce one from another. There's a saying that I really like that, you know, referring to customer experience and even user experience or student experience, it might not be my fault, but it's my problem, right? It might not be our fault, but it's our problem. That it might be the insurance company, or it might be the EHR system that the patient's trying to use to get access to his or her medical records. It might be the phone company or the cell company where the person can't make a phone call because their call's being dropped. It could be the roads in the parking on the way to the clinic. It could be any number of things that are impacting that experience. But for people, for customers, for patients, for students, for users, they might not be able to separate where our responsibility begins and ends. So we really do have to take a look at the totality of experience within the ecosystem, not just the part that we're responsible for. And that's that broad-based approach, that ability to step back and look at the big picture. It becomes really an important element where sociology excels, looking at the big picture. And so looking at experience design, what we're looking at is we're looking at, you know, 4 different areas, elements of experience design. I would break them down into 4 areas at least. Methodological approach, right, that are often rooted in types of design thinking, the study and understanding of people, how they work, makes them tick, how they perceive things, how we can frame things in particular kinds of ways to get them to see things differently. Situated context in complex systems, as well as institutional settings. So, you know, there's a place where this is happening, and that place is embedded in a larger system and often within a larger institution like healthcare, right? And also the measurement and evaluation of outcomes as a result of those design decisions. This is a lot to cover, and this is all of what I'm going to be covering in my graduate class on ethnography for experience design. But for this webinar, I wanted to focus in on the first and third, to both give sociologists a sense of what design thinking means, and also give designers a more broader view of what systems design thinking, what I call systems-based design thinking means. And then also looking at the systems-based correlate to traditional individual levels of measurement that you find in a lot of experience design areas like user experience or customer experience or patient experience or student experience, blowing that out to look at more of a complex system perspective. For many of you, this slide will be familiar. For some of you, it won't. So for the sociologists who don't understand this, this is what would be called design thinking, the stages in design thinking. Empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And you can find different iterations of this, but this is primarily what design thinking refers to. The first step, learning about your audience, learning about the audience for whom you are designing by observation and interview. For sociologists, you should already start to resonate with this thing. One of the things that we try to do often, especially with the Verstehen approach of interpretation, understand people's subjective experiences. When we're doing interviews, when we're doing observations, when we're doing focus groups, and other kinds of data collection approaches, we're trying to understand the people we're studying. And it's the same step in design thinking. We're trying to understand the people we're designing for. The only difference is in a foundational sociological approach, the purposes of doing that study is for academic publication, academic purposes. You move out of the foundational into the translational and implementation, then we start getting to applied sociology and clinical sociology. And without going through each step of this, because we don't have enough time, this is the idea here that we're trying to address their needs. I just had a conversation at my school around a degree program that we have, and I said, well, what do the students want? We're talking about redesigning our school website. And I said, what words do the students use to talk about these things? We're designing for them. We need to take them into consideration. We shouldn't just necessarily start with what we think as faculty. We need to think about what students want and need as well. And oh, by the way, they're not our ultimate customer necessarily. Businesses, family, alumni, et cetera, are also stakeholders in this design universe. IDEO out of Palo Alto, California, and this is free to download online. The Field Guide to Human-Centered Design. And if anybody here has ever looked at this, and the sociologists should do so, what they're describing is basically anthropology and sociology, but with a design orientation. Starting with people, their needs, creating empathy for them, generating ideas, creating prototypes, and then sharing those prototypes back with those people. And what's really interesting about the IDEO human-centered design approach is that they're using this approach to look at some fundamental social problems: poverty, water access, education, infant mortality, voting rights, egalitarianism. They are trying to use this design methodology, linking it in with an anthropological, sociological perspective to create solutions. Very reminiscent of what we would know as participatory action research. At the AACS conference back in October, I delivered a talk during a seminar on participatory action research, social justice, and participatory design in the Jay Weinstein memorial session. And I need to write that up still, but this idea of integrating the humanistic foundations of action research, participatory action research, and social justice with human-centered design. There is a lot of crossover here that would help inform each other, right? In participatory action research, we have life in society, we have action as experience, and we have research as mind and knowledge, and they all meet together working with the people we're researching to both construct the research, collect the data, analyze the results, and come up with the conclusions. Whether the conclusion would be academic writing or the conclusion would be prototyping a new product, good, service, experience. And this leads me to what I call socially embedded design, and steps along those ways, which really, I think, does lend a sociological orientation with design thinking. First step, we assume nothing, right? We question everything. And one of the things we teach people when we're doing research methods class as undergraduates even is, ask the next question. What do you mean by this? Let me ask you a dumb question. Can you explain that a little bit more? Really asking people to dig deeper into explanations about things that they say and concepts that they use. We investigate in context, right? Embedded investigating. Some of you might think about it as contextual inquiry. Perspective switching, being able to take different roles, different identities. In sociology, we're well versed in identity theory, whether it be things like, George Herbert Mead's Mind, Self, and Society, or Looking Glass Selves, or feminist theory, or intersectionality. There's a lot of theoretical approaches that we can use to look at things from people's different perspectives. And this is where sociology is well suited to lend itself to experience design. Designing prototypes in the field, pulling from human-centered design. Testing it in the field, not just in a lab, but going into the context in which it's going to be used to test it to see how it performs. Evaluating the results of that testing with the people we're designing for and the client we're designing with. And then participatory refining, going back to participatory action research, including those who are impacted by this in the process throughout, in context in which it's going to be used. And this, I think, starts to become important for experience design because it does start to blend in sociological orientation, especially ethnographic orientation, with design thinking methodologies. And I'll stop there for a second. There's a lot going on there. Are there any questions, comments, observations related to anything we've talked about so far, linking up sociology and design thinking? And feel free to type it in the webinar chat box if you could. Okay, seeing nothing, I'm going to keep going. And in experience design, as in sociology, we treat things from a systems perspective, looking at the big picture. This is a similar perspective of how we think of an ecosystem as being composed of an interrelated set of things that form a whole. This is how wetlands work, right? And I usually have an image here that looks at the flooding that took place in Houston during one of the hurricanes, and that it wasn't just quote unquote an act of God. The ecosystem was impacted because wetlands that would traditionally have existed, which could have managed higher amounts of water, were paved over. And so there was no place for the water to go but to collect in certain locations, which then flooded because of the poor drainage. And so we understand how ecosystems work. We take an ecosystem perspective. We know that we can't touch one thing without it affecting other things. We can't touch patient experience without it affecting other parts of that healthcare system. We can't touch on customer experience without it affecting other parts of that system, or any user experience without affecting other parts of that system. So we just don't look at that individual person in that experience ecosystem. We look at the ecosystem as a whole. So for instance, we might think about human-computer interaction. Now, again, I teach in a UX program. I started teaching this UX program without having any knowledge whatsoever of what user experience was. I was simply asked to teach a course on ethnography in this grad program. Being an ethnographer, I thought it would be, not too difficult to do, and I would learn along the way. And it's been a tremendous learning experience for me. I've gotten a crash course in user experience, both from the faculty that teach in that program and the students that attend my class as well. I always learn something from them. And we have students from some, Fortune 50 companies and some from startups. So I get the whole range. And traditionally, UX has been primarily a cognitive psychological discipline that has focused on human-computer interaction or computer-human interaction. So you'll see the letters HCI or CHI or CHI, which talks about looking at this person using this interface, looking at this person using this device. Being a sociologist, however, I approach it from a computer-supported cooperative work perspective. It's impossible for me just to look at the individual, not impossible, but not as advantageous for me to look at the individual using the technology without thinking of this larger, what I would call context of accountability. When I was looking at physicians using EHR systems, electronic health record system, part of the issue wasn't the functionality of the interface. It wasn't the screen itself. It wasn't their ability to look at information. It was how that information resided in a larger healthcare system. I actually had one physician say to me, before I order a test in the system, I'll ask my patient if his health insurance or his life insurance is where he wants it, because once I order a test for sleep apnea, it's going to impact his ability to get life insurance or health insurance. That's a systems perspective. The use has nothing to do with the functionality of the system, of the technology itself. It has to do with how that technology resides in a larger system of a larger information system and organizational system. Part of, when I was doing research on enterprise systems, part of the issue of adoption wasn't just about functionality. It was about, do I want to use something in a way that's going to make me visible to others? I had salespeople say, even though we have a pipeline management system for our projects, I'm supposed to, when I get a lead, enter that into the system. I'm not going to, though, because once I enter it into the system, then I'm accountable for delivering on that lead. I'm not going to enter that information into the system until much later when I know the lead is short. That is not an HCI problem. That's a computer-supported cooperative work problem. That's a systems problem. And you can't understand technological use without understanding the larger context in which it is used. You might be able to test certain features, but to really understand it, you need to look at it in action. We can go to customer experience, and I'm pulling here from the CXPA, of which I am a member of the Customer Experience Professionals Association. I've hosted events with them, both here at Bentley and on my own. And they have a wonderful framework here, 6-discipline customer experience framework. And some of this should be familiar to people who are sociologists. For example, culture, a fundamental element, right? You can't change customer experience in an organization without changing the organization's culture. Metrics and ROI, customer understanding, all of these great things. However, one of the things that's missing here when we talk about customer experience is employee experience. That as we look at the ecosystem, we start to identify we can't drive a customer experience without first starting with the employee experience. And this is, a lot of people are starting to realize this. Part of the reason why I'm teaching this class in employee experience for our MBA program in the spring, or in the summer, I should say. Because the first step to driving and improving customer experience is starting with your employee experience. If you just do customer experience without employee experience, it can have the opposite impact of driving down morale because you're not supporting the people who are supposed to be delivering that experience. And so IBM here, this is their model, there's other models, talk about the social sphere, interactions employees have with others in the work setting, with one another. Do you have a culture in the organization of support? If we're working on commission and I'm working against you, I'm not going to support you in your work and you're not going to support me in mine. To what level is trust? To what level do I have autonomy, responsibility, appreciation, ownership? So there's a lot going on with creating a culture of your internal customers, which are your employees. The work sphere, right? How I interact with the process itself and the technology that supports its process. And the interactions I have with the environment itself. I mean, for those of you who are working in open offices where that was once, yes, that's going to be the solution. We're all going to move to open offices. Now people are looking at it going, maybe not so much. Maybe we need to rethink that physical environment in which this is delivered, or working from home as we're doing right now, delivering this webinar online. What kind of experience does this create? How do we create a more integrative experience in distributed teams, which is something I was looking at with my work on distributed software development teams, which is really fundamentally about employee experience. So the ecosystems perspective would be looking at those elements, not just CX, but also EX, digital experience, administrator experience, on down the line. Patient experience I mentioned, right? So we can think about patient experience as that touch point between physician and patient. What happens in the exam room, whether with the doctor, the nurse practitioner, the physician's assistant, whatever health, allied health professional we're talking about. At the same time, we know that our experience with medicine is not just about that care moment, it's also that moment across healthcare. And this is really a big area, right? I mean, if you start to, for those who are, medical sociologists, the expanse of this is humongous. And this is where I think as sociologists, we really are in a position to help as well, is that we understand that institution, right? We understand, hopefully we have an idea, at least understand better than most, the totality and enormity of it, because we can then translate that complexity into action, which is the slogan of my consultancy, ethnoanalytics. Translating that complexity, the scope, right, of that institution into something that's manageable. Even though I do work in healthcare, and I would not consider myself a medical sociologist, but having that awareness that there's a lot out there can help drive our designing of these experiences that take these things into account as well. Let me pause there for a second. Any questions? Well, Melissa has one. Do you have good time-efficient strategies for ensuring that you are aligning all of these? I'm working more on alignment and teaching, and this visual has me thinking about alignment of these factors in our consulting projects. Well, Melissa, I am going to have a slide here in a second on learning experience. So just stay tuned, right? Next slide coming up. Good time-efficient strategies. It reminds me of something a senior VP of marketing or sales said to me one time. There's turnaround time, or time, quality, and price. You can have any two of those. It really does become tricky. I will talk about a learning experience initiative we have here at Bentley right now that I'm helping to head up, called the Learning Transmography, and it's a design thinking, innovation accelerator that we started here at Bentley. Me and another colleague started here at Bentley to try to get this alignment. I think the first step is awareness, right? That if you're not aware of where things are going wrong. It's as if you were plucking one string of a harp or a piano without knowing that there's other strings in that box, okay? Once you figure out that there's more strings, then you can start to manipulate them. As you manipulate them more, you become more facile at the manipulation, so you become better at it. And so I don't know right now that there is one way of being more time efficient. I do think ethnographic awareness is key to this. I think ethnographic orientation to the totality of these things, being able to suspend your own expertise and seek the expertise of others, having the ability to look at the data that exists. This is where big data can come in handy, and then linking it up with the data you have to collect in context. And this is part of what I do in my consultancy, is work with companies to help develop a strategy to manage all of that. So happy to talk with you more, Melissa, about these things, because I think that, especially in the learning piece, there are things we're doing here at Bentley which can be instructive to managing that. And on that point, going to this next slide, student experience. And this is one that hits really close to home. We're going through an interesting time here at Bentley. We have a new president. We have a new administrative team. And they were starting to say, we need to look at student experience. And I right away said, as department chair, I said, no, we don't need to look at student experience. That's only one part of it. We need to look at learning experience. And I created a graph of a learning ecosystem. As incomplete as it is a heuristic. It's kind of, like the simplified map of the different stakeholder groups that I could think of. And there's the image that we created for our learning transmography. And when we're designing, we're doing design challenges right now internally. When we're doing design challenges with this team that we created, that's cross-functional, there's both faculty and staff, what we're doing is thinking creatively about how we can align different elements of this ecosystem. One of the points that we've made in our vision document is that feasible and practical are often ways of saying business as usual. So what we're trying to do is be as impractical and unfeasible as possible when we're doing these integrative alignments. We're trying to see how we can create connections and leverage assets across this ecosystem. And the assets piece here is really, really crucial. There was a community development approach that I was trained in when I was working at United Way Community Services in Detroit called assets-based community development. It was started by a person named John McKnight. He started an institute at Northwestern University. And rather than going into communities and just doing a needs assessment of what's missing, what his approach emphasized was going in and doing an inventory of what assets are available. And then finding ways of leveraging those assets to create a more sustainable and a more community-centric version of community development. It wasn't the outsider coming in and establishing what needs to be done. It's the outsider coming in and facilitating those internally to create that community experience. And so going back to your question, Melissa, I do think that this is the approach that we're using, and it's an approach that I think is really important. I was talking with a colleague of mine who is a sociologist in the management department here, and he was talking about the approach of consulting, either expert or process consultant. Often the model of consultant was expert, right? The consultant comes in and says, we are going to tell you what you need to do because we are the experts. Now, as sociologists, sometimes we do that, but more often we're process. We're going to help facilitate that. But really what we need to strike is this in between, okay? Is, you know, I know something, okay? As a sociologist, I'd like to think I know something. But you know more than me. You're the experts in the areas in which you live. We need to be complementary. And so then we really get into this idea of experience design as being complementary experience design. I'm helping to facilitate that messaging across this experience ecosystem as a sociologist. And one of the key strengths of sociology, I hope, not all sociology, but at least people I like to hang out with, I'll say us applied sociologists, is helping to facilitate in a guided path, but never assuming that I have all the answers, helping to facilitate the information collection. I'll get to these points in a sec. Information collection, interpretation, and designing, translation, and implementation of design solution. And this is what I was talking about here, right? The idea of sociology and experience design. The strengths I think sociology has and the ways in which we can lend to experience design and the ways in which we can instruct experienced designers how to do their job better, hopefully, and learn from them at the same time. You know, one of the things I always appreciated from the work that I do, even with some of us might call it inductive research, is unmotivated looking, right? We're starting just, I don't know what I'm going to find. I'm just looking for that moment where we just kind of go, huh, look at that. If someone goes, huh, that's when you know you got a thing. And that's where you know you got a thing to explore. And a lot of this is rooted, I would, you know, again, say in ethnographic inquiry and inductive research, which is where I tend to go. Sometimes I'll go deductive where I have an idea and I want something I want to test. Deductive being primarily the way UX often works, right? It's hypothesis testing. Nothing wrong with that. Some of my best friends do hypothesis testing. But it's also looking at that unmotivated looking. I'm just going to check things out. I'm just going to take a look around and see what pops up. Even though I have these other assumptions out there that I have in my head, I have to be able to suspend those for a little while. Critical thinking being a key piece, not only about what the users are doing, not just being critical of the user, the customer, the patient, the student, etc., right? But also critical of our own knowledge. Being critical of everything, questioning everything. And then, you know, it's what I call asking the next question, right? Not assuming that I know what someone means. Always looking for opportunities to do that deeper level investigation. Big picture viewing, being able to step back and look at the big picture. One of the things that I've done just on my own is I've studied art instructors in terms of how they teach their students how to see. Because if I'm an ethnographer, I'm teaching my students how to see. That's what art instructors do. Artists will often step back from their painting or drawing to see how it all looks together. This is what we talk about when we talk about gestalts, how all those elements come together as a objective whole. And that's stepping back and stepping forward. You step forward to focus on an individual moment or element. You step back to see how it all fits back together. Understanding people. That's what we try to do as sociologists. We understand people, right? We look at how not just individual people live or what they do, but how they experience that doing in groups, what it looks like in group settings. We capture context, right? Context matters. And what works well in one location might not work well in another location. Sometimes we call context culture, right? We capture culture. That's one of the things that from the intro levels we talk about in sociology. And then developing research. One of the things that I think sociology can do really well, and I don't want to offend my anthropology friends here, but our methodological toolkit is much bigger. There's a real tension in experience design between this overly analytic, but the quantitative analytic approach of big data. But people have to remember that qualitative data is data too. And just like you do big data quantitative analytics, you can do qualitative analytics, whether it be doing narrative analysis, conversation analysis, content analysis, discourse analysis, etc. I taught a 2-day program here at Bentley on qualitative data analysis, and this was geared at professionals. This was not for sociology graduate students. We don't have any of those. It was a 2-day training program on how to not really collect, but really manage and analyze qualitative data. Because a lot of organizations have a lot of qualitative data they never look at because they don't know how. And that's where, as a consultant, part of my consultancy is going in and helping them do that. But we don't have to stop there. We're really talking about mixed methods research. And I should mention here that next month, Dr. Karen Albright from the University of Denver will be giving a webinar on mixed method approaches, especially in grantsmanship, but mixed method approaches across the board. There's this term of a bricolage approach, right? A toolkit. And as sociologists, we're taught from Research 1 how to do both quantitative and qualitative, and hopefully, ideally, bring those together. They don't have to be antagonistic. They can live together, right? And as a sociologist, we have the ability to bring those things together. Any questions so far about this slide, about what sociology has to bring to experience design? Okay, the final slide before we take any questions about the why do experience design. For me, when people ask me about this, especially sociologists who are a little bit hesitant to engage in the corporate world, right? Somehow we've been taught that helping people make money is a bad thing. I ask them this question. Think about your most recent frustrating experience, whether it be in the doctor's office, registering for classes, getting something fixed, your computer crashing in the morning, and then trying to get them to believe that it's not going to work and you need a solution. Whatever it might be, right? Going to the DMV and trying to get your license renewed. Think about your most recent frustrating experience. How thankful would you be if someone made it better, right? What would it be worth to you to have somebody make that experience better? We are in a position as sociologists and experience designers to make people's lives better. And it's not a small thing, right? The smallest things in our day, if they're frustrating, can ruin the day for us, and much more. And so what it's really about is trying to make things better for people using our sociological insights, coupled with the design orientation and methodologies, to create integrated and easier, and in some instances, really exciting or delightful experience. So thank you very much. We have a few minutes left. If anybody has any questions or would like to make any comments, please go ahead and use the chat box to your right. Or I don't know if it's to your right, but somewhere on your screen it's to my right. If you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and use the chat box and I will respond to you. I will also say, as I mentioned before, this will be online, fingers crossed, the technology works, at our Applied U YouTube channel. And if you have any direct comments or questions, you can use one of the 2 emails made available in the bottom left, either gdavid@bentley.edu or garydavid@ethno-analytics.com. Any questions? Or any, I'll even take compliments if you have any of those too. And I just say to round out, as people might be typing, for me, what makes this exciting is the opportunity to really, especially employee experience, empower people to do their jobs. Being from Detroit originally, union blood runs deep in my veins. Workers' rights runs deep in my veins. And the thing about employee experience is the opportunity to go beyond, employee engagement and the functional elements of human resources, and into really allowing for some level fulfillment through doing of work. And this is where humanistic overtones of a lot of sociology, some of you might attend the humanist meetings, that really starts to come together. And if you go back to this idea of, the American Association for Applied and Clinical Sociology, to promote positive social change. And this is what we're trying to do here. We're trying to promote positive experiences, a positive experience design. And by linking up our sociological insights with those working in fields, that we're in a better position to do so. I would also add, if you're curious about how to make those connections, go to our website, and our Applied U website, and there's some practical instructions on how to reach out to experienced designers and interface with them more completely. And thanks, John. Would love to go deeper and get more details on the application of this practice in business context, etc. I would too, and there's a lot of opportunity to do that. If you'd like to take this offline by emailing me off the webinar, I have some, in the work that I do with different companies, some ways of having that conversation and furthering that conversation of how we can apply this in a business context with some actual case examples. Anything else? Seeing nothing, I want to thank you all very much. I want to thank Ethnoanalytic, which is me, Bentley University, and our computing services folks, and also the Association for Applied and Clinical Sociology, and appreciate everybody who took the time today to take part in this webinar. I hope everyone has a really happy holidays, whether you're just concluding or just starting up or extending this for as long as possible. And look for an announcement for our February webinar on mixed method approaches, and especially around doing grants, but application and doing research. And with that, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everybody.